How are we doing? We're good? Excellent. Thank you very much. My name is Leon Potter. I'm the chair of the theater department and the MC for the colloquium series. For starters, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Snuneymuxw First Nations, and we are very happy to be able to learn and laugh and play and work and do all these kinds of exciting events here on this land, which is fantastic. I'd also like to take a moment to thank Dr. Claire Grogan and the Arts and Humanities Department who work so hard to put this together, and all the presenters throughout the year who do all the fine work bringing these kind of colloquiums to us, which is wonderful. And the support that we get is from the Arts and Humanities Department and from the VIU in general is crucial to our success, which is fantastic. At this point, I would like very much to introduce the introducer. This sounds odd, but I'd like to introduce the introducer for the speaker. So basically, I'd like to introduce Dr. Amelia Harsberg, and if you'd like to come up to the stage. Take it away.
Thanks, Leon. Good morning. Failure. Failure is what brings us together today. When I think of failure and the theoretical nature of failure, I think of my friend and colleague, Mike Roberson. Now, while I have little to no experience with failure, clearly no failed relationships in my lifetime, no parent fails with my teenager, no professional failures, and zero failures with my students in the classroom space. I have come to Professor Roberson's colloquium to learn with an open mind about how and why Mike can take the soul-sucking nature of failure and use the experiences as a vehicle to ethically engage in his world, in his poetry, and his teaching practice. Together, join me now in welcoming Professor Mike Roberson to the stage. Enjoy. Have fun. All right.
Some of you may be familiar with this song. It's called Anthem from Leonard Cohen. It's a song, and the center image of it, the center message of it is that cracks are how the light gets in. In some sense, where the failure occurs is where the light comes in, where success can happen. So I felt it was appropriate to start segue in that way with a little music. So I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank Amelia. I want to thank Leon. I want to thank members of the colloquium committee for allowing me to present. There must be some mistake. And of course, I want to acknowledge the fact that I am presenting on traditional territory. Very grateful for that today. Yesterday was American Thanksgiving. I'm an American. I'm thankful that you're all here today, so thank you. So let me go back to my notes for a moment, because I ultimately want to start with three perspectives, but I also want to begin with a disclaimer, and I want to begin with a proviso. Okay, so I'm going to be talking sort of in 3 different arcs here. From my own perspective, from a pedagogical perspective, and ultimately from a research perspective, but also from a writer's perspective, talking about the poetics of failure. But I want to make a prediction and I want to make a disclaimer, because what's important here in thinking about failure is it's a very, very precarious subject in itself. So to sit up here and advocate, espouse for failure is a risk in itself, because not everyone is available to receive failure. Not everyone has the luxury, or in my case, the privilege to fail. Especially when we think about the material circumstances in many people's lives, whether as a student or simply as a person, we're not all able to fail or to embrace failure. And that when we fail, the stakes are massive, financial, again, material, in terms of housing. So I have to be very careful about standing up here in front of you and essentially spouting off about this. But I'm going to do my best in that way. And we may talk about this in the question and answer period, but I'm up here really to reclaim failure in certain ways. Mostly philosophically, to think about failure as not a means to success, but in and of itself, as a value, as a virtue, and as a kind of vision. So bear with me, if you will. That's my disclaimer. Now, my prediction is that I will fail. I'm going to fail very particularly, and I'm going to fail very deliberately, and I'm going to tell you in what way. What you will not hear, and this is a classic means of capitalizing on a means of failure. To use a rhetorical term, it's called apophasis. It means basically to talk about something in the negative, means to talk about something without talking about it. So I'm going to fail to bring up the most quintessential comment on failure that's surrounded us, that's circulating in common parlance. That's from Samuel Beckett. You won't hear anything about Samuel Beckett from me. I will fail to do that on purpose. Okay? I'm just making that quick prediction. Okay? All right. Let's get started. So, I want to start with personal failure in terms of discovery. Now, to hearken back to the Leonard Cohen song, where cracks let the light get in, I want to invoke the Japanese notion of kintsugi, sometimes called the poetic mend, which is basically taking broken pottery and bringing it back together with seams of gold, essentially to capitalize on a broken product to make it better than it once was, not hiding it, not pretending that the end goal is a success of covering it up, but capitalizing on the poetic mend, on that gold, showcasing the cracks, so to speak. The other way that I want to organize this talk is with 3 sets of poems, one of which will be mine. And I want to read those poems to you, and I'm going to leave them on the screen so that you can kind of reflect as then I move through each of these 3 sections. The first poem is from Antonio Machado. I'm giving you the first 2 and the most essential stanzas, but I'm going to obviously read the entirety of it. And I'm going to riff on it before I start talking about the personal side. Last night, as I was sleeping, I dreamt, marvelous error, that a spring was breaking out in my heart. I said, along which secret aqueduct, O water, are you coming to me, water of new life that I have never drunk? Last night, as I was sleeping, I dreamt, marvelous error, that I had a beehive here inside my heart, and the golden bees were making white combs and sweet honey from my old failures. Last night, as I was sleeping, I dreamt, marvelous error, that a fiery sun was giving light inside my heart. It was fiery because I had warmth as from a hearth, and sun because it gave light and brought tears to my eyes. Last night as I slept, I dreamt, marvelous error, that it was God I'd had here inside my heart. Let me tell you a little bit about this poem, about its failure. This is a translation from the Spanish, translation by Robert Bly. There are two liberties taken with this poem in this translation. One is marvelous error. The original Spanish, if you were to take it in a dictionary-style translation, suggests marvelous illusion, but Bly, in translating it, chooses the word error rather than illusion. Similarly, the end of that second stanza, right? My old failures, the original Spanish translate as bitterness. But Bly specifically fails to translate this, so to speak, right, verbatim, to bring out the original idea, takes liberties with it. For no other reason but so that I could bring it here and share it with you today. And it has its own meaning from a failed translation. So that's the first. However, more appropriate to what I want to talk about for a moment, marvelous error. To capitalize, to suggest that error is somehow can be marvelous, that it can be prized. For no other reason but because it takes on new life, right, in reshaping our old failures into this beautiful, obviously, the white cones and sweet honey inside the heart. I think it's an appropriate way of engaging this. And of course, I'm going to eventually talk about poetry and failure more so. But this is how it's centered not only in the life of the poet narrator, but also in the poem itself. An interesting case for the value of failure in that way. So now I'm going to fail to be so unscripted because now I'm going to my script. So one of the ways that I approach this, obviously, is to be very self-conscious about how I started. So I began writing this, and I immediately erased its opening. I began with the word when originally, but was I going to ask a question or offer a description? Use it as an adverb or a conjunction? In many ways, now that I have succumbed in beginning another way, I meant both. In other words, I'm in pursuit of an origin and in pursuit of a statement about failure. I was making time and space for my point in my imagination and on the page. So, therefore, I acknowledged my mistake, and I recognized it immediately, and that is my point. I had wanted to begin discussing my ongoing interest in failure. What is its nature? When did it begin? On the one hand, my interest began as soon as I became aware of wanting to be the best at something, the best in class. Unfortunately, it took a long time to realize that the best ultimately amounted to being or feeling better than. The best was not an objective standard, but a subjective experience. So on the other hand, my interest evolved once I stopped being the best and gave up on being the best. This occurred in the context of an experiment. What would happen if and when I gave up on trying to be the best? And I should say I was working on this in high school. So I did. For a time, I was like Bartleby. I didn't do anything, just to see what it felt like to fail. Unfortunately, this kind of failure wasn't very productive, since it simply led to raising concerns and worry to the people around me. There had to be another way to be nonconformist, a teenager. A more productive failure manifested a little later when I was writing a statement of purpose as part of a scholarship to get into university. I remember justifying my interest in what I thought I wanted to do at the time, which was become an athletic trainer. I remember tracing my time as a highly awarded soccer player, which culminated not in ongoing success, but in failure. A failure that I turned into conditions for future success. Long story short, I justified my interest in athletic training on the basis of my relative failure as an athlete. When I entered high school at 14, I was playing varsity level soccer and was runner-up for goalkeeper of the year. By the time my tenure was up in grade 12, I wasn't hardly starting on the field. What I continued to do, however, was fulfill a role not supplied otherwise. What I continued to do was tape, treat, help fellow players, coach. In other words, I discovered in my failure a path to success. I framed my strength in terms of my weakness. This is a theme you will hear again and again today. So inevitably, I went off to university and I failed as an athletic trainer. And I ultimately discovered my love for philosophy and literature. Fast forward, and that dynamic of strength manifesting from weakness becomes central component of my interest in my doctoral dissertation. There, I trace the history of documents that come to the defense of literature, and poetry in particular, against its various opponents. From Plato's dismissal of poets from the Republic to the present day, I was interested in how poetry was essentially failing through the centuries. My contention is that each of these defenses is couched in claims that asserts poetry's strengths generate out of its very weaknesses, that its defenders turn the very arguments against it into proposals of its strength. The classic argument is that poetry, but perhaps literature more generally, doesn't deal in truth and therefore potentially misleads, and of course it does. That is its objective. So is born the claim that essentially poets are all liars who only tell the truth. At the center of this debate between the opponent and the apologist is an expectation that poetry has some responsibility, some ethical obligation. I'll go into that more in the third half, as my biology teacher used to say. And so part of my claim is about grounding poetry's ethical responsibility in its ability to generate its strength out of its purported failures. Let me clarify a little bit about how I understand ethics, very basically, not super philosophically. It's through a poetic lens. The poet Robert Duncan, who basically described responsibility as keeping the ability to respond, maintaining openness to that. Hence why poetry becomes so apt in that way. But that sense of responsibility, in my mind, is the core of any ethics. If I were to invoke a philosopher, if anyone is loves their theory, you might think about Emmanuel Levinas in that regard. But I'm not going to go there. We're going to keep this casual. Because in a moment, I think I might even bring in Eminem. So let's leap again ahead beyond that to my time here at VIU. When I first arrived, I was working in the writing center, led by Theo at the time. I think he's up here. And I was working alongside our now emeritus professor, John LePage. At the time, he was teaching our English 115, which is university writing and research, and he was teaching a book called Being Wrong. Adventures in the Margin of Error by Catherine Schultz. And I asked him about it. And I got a little bit of a response. He said, it's probably the best thing I've ever taught and the most difficult. Of course, I should admit that I failed many times to sit down with him to discuss how the teaching of this book actually went and for him to elaborate. But nonetheless, he does come into the pub that I work in, comes in after golf, and sometimes I say, you know what? Let's talk about failure. But I don't. I got to work. Anyway, so here was this idea of failure again brimming. And then, of course, last spring, on this very stage, Marnie Stanley, our old Dean of Arts and Humanities, stood on this very stage, citing the terrific quip by Quentin Crisp. At first you don't succeed, failure may be your style. And I thought, if we want to think about, if we believe that the universe sends us signs, maybe that was a sign. Then, one day, Theo grabs me by the scruff, and he says, you will be presenting next year in the colloquium. No, he didn't actually do that. He asked me, right? And I said, you know what? I'm going to take a risk. I'm going to take a chance. I'm going to present on this idea of failure. I don't know what the hell I'm going to do, but I'm going to do it. So here I am today, right? And I'll ask this question, why failure? Why am I infatuated with it? Why does it come up in various iterations in my life? Because I think at the heart of my interest and in my engagement with it deliberately, and perhaps not so deliberately, is that there's something essentially ethical about failure. In particular, failure forces us back to take stock, to take responsibility. In licking our wounds, we are humbled. And in my personal opinion, humility is what we need today. We need to approach the world knowing that failure is more central to being a human being than we truly realize. As Catherine Schultz from the book that John LePage introduced me to, as she writes, for every species, error is a mechanism for survival and change. For us, human organisms, with our richer relationship to wrongness, mistakes enable not only our biological evolution, but our social, emotional, and intellectual evolution as well. And according to the neuroscientist Dean Burnett in his book, The Idiot Brain, he suggests that our brains don't handle uncertainty well. And this is his overall conclusion. On the one hand, our imaginations are in service to our brains, which will inevitably see threats where there aren't any. It will devise patterns and seek patterns where there aren't any. And it will devise worst-case scenarios even after the fact, when nothing bad happened in the first place. In other words, our brains fail quite often. But on the other hand, this ability to conjure, to conjecture, to predict are all part of the same imagination that creates art. And as Schultz says, our ability to make mistakes is the basis for our ability to imagine solutions, create possibility, and spur hope. So again, my sense is that a path through uncertainty, ongoing climate catastrophe, iterations of the pandemic, obviously the wars in the Middle East and Ukraine, our path through is not by seeking rightness, definition, absolutism. It's messy, but in embracing our failure to know exactly and to embrace humility. We need, as Alan Watts offered us back in 1951, in a time that he also called one of uncertainty, anxiety, and vulnerability, the wisdom of insecurity. So, as I think about this for a second and reflect as I begin to transition, I think I should have ended my talk this way. I kind of failed. Anyway. So, teaching failure, practice. I want to point out this picture to you. This is Michael Landry's art bin from 2010, what he calls a monument to creative failure. If you notice, if you can kind of see, it's essentially on the one hand, a dumpster made of glass panels. It's an installation in an art gallery. But don't be misled, it is still a dumpster. But it's transparent, right? So in the dumpster, this is where we throw out our old detritus, all of our trash, everything that's gone. As you can see in the back, it's all the shit. But we get to see it. It is a monument, so we get to see. And the idea is that he welcomed other artists to come dispose of their failed art in that way and put it on display as a celebration, as a monument. Right? So there is this grandeur, this celebration of failure at the same time, recognizing it for what it is. It is not a stepping stone to something else. It is exactly what it is. It is basically trash in a dumpster. An interesting way to begin thinking about how do we integrate into a classroom situation a belief in the messiness of what goes on there and what goes on there in learning. So I want to offer you now the second poem. This is my poem. I wrote this. And in it, obviously, is the title to my talk. Maybe another sign that I was supposed to do this. I wrote this before. There must be some mistake. The mark of my craft is a mistake, error. A cleat and covered hole, measured twice and cut wrong. Not a result, but an effort. A spray of saliva in the face of perfection, down my chin or in the middle of my shirt. A celebration of just okay. A problem that must be absorbed into the design. Kintsugi it's called. But I can't say it right. No good. On the one hand, broken pieces just waiting. On the other, already gold. The gap at the sound at the end of the word, the gap at the end of the word flaw. The sound of disappointment. Can luck be better? Next time, who keeps the ledger of attempts? So this poem, obviously, right, has a double meaning. On the one hand, and you can hear, this is what I tell my students. I was telling them about presentations recently in business and technical writing. When we get stuck on certain verbal patterns, you hear this a lot from me, on the one hand and on the other hand. And so I catch myself sometimes. Maybe it's a mistake, maybe it's a failure, but it works. There must be some mistake. Obviously, an indication that there is a problem, there's a failure. A miscommunication usually. Oh, there must be some mistake. But no, it also works as an insistence. There must be some mistake. We insist that there must be, and this is what the poem is about. Yes, recognizing failure, but that failure is somehow essential. It must be recognized. It must be brought into the light. So, in thinking about the pedagogical side, the applications, the value of failure in that way, I want to go back to my own experience starting in that way and move into more, my experience as a student and move into my experience as being a teacher. So when I started to really be invested in pedagogy, and I would say that this sort of precarious situation of being adjunct, being temporary at various places, even being a grad student, I wasn't as serious. And then at VIU, I become much more serious about this. And so the question that I had to go back to was my long-standing ethical value, my point of attack in teaching, and then ask a question from it. That point of attack is always to be, is to remember, what is it always to be a student? To think about that sympathetic and now more empathetic, because certainly I didn't have to go to school during the pandemic. So there is that gap in our experiences. But nonetheless, I know what it is to have my butt in the seat. I know what it is to be bored. I know what it means to be excited, to be challenged. And so I try and do everything from that perspective, this ethical principle. So I had to ask, in what ways did I learn best? And I thought about it long and hard. And I had this conversation with Theo the other day that was part of the podcast. That thinking about the best moments in which I learned something that I still retain and that I value and that sort of sits in my craw, let alone sits in my imagination about learning, was from failing, was struggling. And of course, this was from teachers who combined compassion with sternness, who recognized that, right, I wasn't doing something right, and had the willingness, right, and the bravery and the thoughtfulness to let me know. So I thought about, okay, if that's the case, how do I begin to integrate that practice? How do I help people, right, offer from a compassionate perspective, understand that failure, right, is going to be beneficial to their learning, right? And so again, thinking about those moments in my own life and trying to replicate those in some degree for my own students. That exams, graduations, any kinds of culminations weren't as impressive as what is going on in the process. What did I struggle with? What did I reach through? And of course, these were both the most nerve-wrenching, but also the most exciting and rewarding times, was in the midst of it all. So again, thinking about how do I integrate this? And of course, taking full advantage of the generosity of the Center for Innovation and Excellence in Learning here on VIU campus, started to take workshops more, to invest myself, learning about, right, this pervasive concept on campus called the growth mindset, right? And I like it. The growth mindset as an avenue towards learning now, but for lifetime learning, as opposed to a kind of fixed mindset, one that's about absorbing process. But what doesn't get articulated, even in the discussions in CL, in those workshops, is an attention deliberately to failure. So I went outside that terminology. I went to the idea of productive failure by a theorist in the name of Manu Kapoor, talks about this, and suggests there's 4 ways that we bring failure into it. And of course, it overlaps with much of the approaches we see to teaching. It's that we begin by essentially activating people's knowledge or lack of knowledge in a situation. We force a problem upon students that asks them to figure out, do they know how to do this or not? And of course, for me, this is always the opportunity to find out, how do you write the right question to get what you need? How do you ask the right question, I should say? So it's this activating, right, this sense of what you know and what you don't. Becoming essentially aware of that. In order to then begin to feel, and from a facilitator perspective, manage that and encourage that affect that comes with feeling like you don't know. That the stakes aren't high because this is exactly what you're supposed to be doing, struggling in this moment. So, right, there's this idea of becoming aware of the problem or the lack of knowledge and what you do know and that you may have solutions. And of course, when we don't have a formula to follow, we often have to improvise. And this is where we also get innovations. People get creative with approaches that we don't necessarily see as instructors. So there's this idea of being aware, of activating this knowledge, of bringing affect into the situation. In other words, trying to make people feel comfortable in being uncertain and uncomfortable before we essentially step in as facilitators, and of course with their fellow students, in this step that Kapoor calls assembly. The idea of bringing together all the different possibilities of what we know, what we don't know, and then from a facilitator's perspective saying, this is what else you can bring into it. This is the sort of textbook version that can help you answer this question. But in the meantime, you've become quite humble in this position of knowing what you know and what you don't know and trying to pursue, right, those gaps. So it's beginning from a sense of failure. And of course, I'm on board with this process because it's about integrating, but also about demystifying and disempowering this idea of failure itself, particularly in its more traditional or conventional notions, and to reclaim it for its use very deliberately. So when one of the first days of class, probably the first day, one of the things that I try and impress upon students is how university is different than high school. On the one hand, there's that, right, parallel structure. On the one hand, I suggest if you're a good student in high school, you could breeze through college, university, and do quite well, playing the same game, playing by the same rules you always have. Except you miss an incredible opportunity. At university, the support structures between faculty, staff, the university, especially here at VIU, which encourages such intimacy, you are more supported in your learning than you've ever been, which means that you have the opportunity to take far more chances on, and of course, let's be clear. Paying for your education means that you feel like you're supposed to get something out of it. So failing, the stakes are higher financially in terms of, and I think here about international students who are being funded, who are paying that much more. Failure looks much different from that than from my perspective. I have to be aware of that. I have to be very, very conscious of that. Because again, as Eminem said, sometimes you only get one shot. So failure is not always an option, but there is this way in which we need to sort of bring this in. So on those first days, I introduced them to an idea of intellectual responsibility as opposed to academic responsibility. So that's the other hand. Intellectual responsibility or academic responsibility, let me start there, is basically what it means to be a good student. To show up, put your butt in the seat, play by the rules, do the assignments, try and meet the expectations of your instructor, your professor. All well and good to a degree, but then there's beyond that, this intellectual responsibility of one, seeking out what you need when you need it and making demands of the people here to help you, to get what you need to learn best, right? To understand, to get support. And having the feeling empowered to make those demands, to take responsibility for your own intellectual development, not simply your academic process. So I think failure, for me, is central to understanding failure, integrating failure into that scenario is important to me. So I started to look into this again in preparing for this talk about what are people actually saying about pedagogies of failure. And there was a great essay on the importance of teaching failure by Edward Berger. This is in Inside Higher Education. And I'm going to quote him a little bit at length because I think it makes an incredible point. He said, "Every idea from every discipline is a human idea that comes from a natural, thoughtful, and ideally unending journey in which thinkers deeply understand the current state of knowledge, take a tiny step in a new direction, almost immediately hit a dead end, learn from the misstep, and through iteration inevitably move forward. That recipe for success is not just the secret formula for original scholarly discovery, but also for wise everyday thinking for the entire population. Hence, it is important to explicitly highlight how essential these dead ends and mistakes are. That is, to teach students the power of failure and to fail effectively. Individuals need to embrace the realization that taking risks and failing are often the essential moves necessary to bring clarity, understanding, and innovation." So, of course, the question is, well, how'd you do it, John? 3 ways. Requires it, he validates it, and then he assesses it. Basically, he says, you have to design an assignment that fails. In other words, often what he does is, from a writing perspective, he integrates early drafts and says, what you're offering me is not ready for submission. And it's going to show those cracks. It's going to show its problems. Bring it in. And everybody's super anxious about it because they think what they put on the page represents their souls. And of course, from a writing teacher's perspective, we have to constantly tell them, this is not a representation of you. This is a representation of a moment in time that you put towards this. So here they are, they bring in this messy bit of writing, and what do, we have to suddenly validate it for its mistakes. Berger explicitly says, hey, nice job. Really great failure in this regard. And of course, again, to create levity around it, right? And so, according to his stories, he says that people will start bragging about the nature of their failures. And it's not intended to be a joke. It's intended to, right, take this quite seriously by creating levity around what it means to fail. So that you are taking that next step and saying, okay, I'm learning from this. This is the problem. Let's look at it. Let's name it. Let's figure out how to diagnose it, and then let's fix it, right? This path to success, so to speak. And then, of course, at the end, he says we have to assess it. How do we assess the amount of failure? And of course, through a reflective assignment. How well did you fail? And ultimately, the goal is to say, how much did you fail, but how much did you understand out of that process, right? We often forget. We understand it theoretically, but we often don't allow for those moments of reflection to take a big part of the writing in any course to help students. And this is the ultimate nature of exams, is to help students reflect on what they know and what they don't know. And if the exams aren't doing that, allowing them to reflect on that gap in knowledge, they're not going to necessarily know what they're coming away with. So I think it's an appropriate model, this require the failure, validate the failure, and assess it. Now, again, in doing some of this research, I discovered a terrific book called, of all names, Pedagogies of Failure, edited by Alison Carr. And in that book, there's a terrific essay called Failure Potential, Using Failure as Feedback, by Darcy L. Toon. And in that, there is this gesture towards the same kinds of issues that Berger is talking about. But the one addition that they make is that as instructors, we need to show our students how to fail. In other words, we need to be open to our own failure. This is a real bold ask of instructors, to be able to acknowledge when they fail, to bring attention to it, to share those stories. But the idea is to ultimately model risk and vulnerability. And that's not a lot let me be clear. It is a lot to ask of a professor, of an instructor, because there is this dynamic of power. But if we want real learning, if we want that facilitation to occur, I think we need to back off on that power structure. Okay, third, poetic failure, celebration. So here, a Picasso sketch, The Painter and the Model Knitting from 1927. This is part of an illustration to, it's part of a number of sketches incorporated into a illustrated version of Balzac's story, the French writer Balzac's story, the original masterpiece. And what this particular sketch is showing is that the painter, right, the artist in the story, Fraunhofer, is sketching. And you can see, in classic sort of Picasso style, represents nothing. It's not realistic at all. In the story itself, so this is Picasso's interpretation, in the story itself, there's all this pent-up energy about Fraunhofer making this incredible masterpiece. And ultimately, the moral of the story is that Fraunhofer fails, doesn't create anything other than basically this mess with a well-designed foot at the bottom of the canvas, right? And it's a tragic failure. This story has iterations since then, becomes integrated by, taken up again by Émile Zola, and has been taken over. The failed artist, the bit of artwork that has its promise but can never be delivered. This gap in promise versus execution. Anybody who's done art knows that, has an idea about what they want to accomplish. When they do it, sometimes there's some relative level of success, but ultimately a kind of failure. So in the next poem that I want to share with you, this is from Laura Riding Jackson. A couple things before I start. Laura Riding Jackson was a modernist poet who basically denounced poetry, went silent, didn't write for decades, and then suddenly came back on the scene because felt like being an accomplished poet still came to the conclusion that poetry failed the world. And late in life, 1995, this is when this is published, decides to talk about this in poetic form. The poem is called In Gratuitous Witness. After I had long nursed a faith in the promise on which poetry has thrived, the recalled promise of language and its careful rising in minds to teach all, little by little, until life and speech are one, union of being with itself, of knowledge with the known, instantaneity, consuming, the separating silence heard is time, the beat of not yet, not yet. Suddenly I saw, startling at each other in me, without interchange, the plight of life and the plight of poetry that I had lovingly judged near same. Words had flocked around the plight of poetry, flutters of promise populating the air, but suddenly I saw how they vanished between plight and plight, nothing sealed as nothing said, only plight and plight left. I saw the nature of the promise. Poetry could only echo it from the forefelt unspoken, all speakable. Suddenly my will changed. In me formed a new sense of the necessary. Poetry itself could not fulfill the promise of language, only reveal, failing ever to be full wording of the speech of lives, promptings of desire, the wish for utterance's utmost given intonations of achievement. I have waited for the breath of life and the breath of speech to mingle. This must come about first in our mind. We must think our way into our station of watchkeeper on the universe, upon the life whole of it. It is the station of speech. Here is the promise of language will be proven, but poetic images of word success abound in our day. And speech failure seems the literarily impossible, and the universal possible of life, true speech, and true speech life, singled out in the human summation, is being broken down into infinitesimal human perversions of the human truth possible. If this is what is happening, how can the promise of language prosper in us and we in it, the universe rejoicing in the event? And when? The event broods over us as we over and when it is. Not knowing when to say it is, the answer waits upon the asking. So again, embodying in this is a hope, a seeing again, but ultimately the center of this, what she calls in an unpublished manuscript, the promise of language and the failure of poetry. Something that it's at the heart of the poetic project. So I want to spend just a few moments. This is where I'm going to get a little bit more scholarly. I want to talk a little bit about my own research in terms of poetic failure. So let me quickly transition into my sort of dissertation thesis, the idea behind it. That, and I mentioned this quickly before, that the history of poetic defenses, these statements that on the one hand say what poetry should do and what it should be, are ultimately in the format of defending them against somebody who's attacked them, basically, or attacked, right, the genre. That in this dynamic, the constant argument is that it capitalizes on its weakness to incur its strength. And of course, we see through the ages that these defenses have articulated a sort of poethics, right? An ethics of responsibility, right? So in the classical period, poetry responds to the world and universal truths. In the early modern period, poetry responds to the audience and personal virtues. In the Romantic period, poetry responds to the poet and imaginative experiences. In the modern and even in the contemporary period, poetry responds to the poem and formal problems. So despite seeming to retreat from an overtly ethical sphere by basically being fantastic imaginative literature, poetic defenses continue to assert that poetry represents a culturally responsible activity, constantly aware of the events, experiences, and technologies that shape culture at every moment. We see this, and I'll trace this quickly, inaugurated by Plato, who says, realistically, doesn't kick the poet out of this theoretical republic, but says, not until you can say that poetry serves civically, right, historically, factually, will we allow it in. But basically doesn't say you're gone, but says do that. So prompts this, creates this, right, momentum for this to occur. And of course, who comes to answer shortly thereafter? Aristotle. And Aristotle has a lot to say about basically saying, well, yeah, poetry says, doesn't deal in fact so well, but it deals in what could happen. This is the argument that gets taken up under these various different kinds of dynamics, if you will, depending on where the source of responsibility is. But it's basically saying it's not about, doesn't deal in facts, doesn't deal in absolutes. It deals in contingencies, it deals in the provisional, and therefore is exactly what it needs to be. But this is because it fails in some regard. So, in all, what these defenses share in espousing for poetry's failure and the fact that it fails to deal in realities is that, again, it generates its strength from its failure. So if mistake is a kind of accidental stumbling into the gap between representation and reality, art is an intentional journey to that same place. The writer Walker Piercy has called metaphor, which is central so often to poetry, to literature, as mistake, that it is deliberately wrong. It is a failure to connect, to make an equation between a comparison. But in doing so, actually reaches out and gets closer to it. I like the word, if you have any math people in here, the idea of the asymptote. It's asymptotic. It gets close to it, but it never reaches it. So in my own naive sense, we continue to have love poems. We continue to have poems, people writing poems over and over, because on the one hand, they fail. They don't live up to what they're supposed to, but maybe they will. There is that hope. So in their very failure, it's generative. So in contemporary poetics, which is my interest, right? And this is also the case in modernist poetics, in modernist poetry, but especially in experimental work now, embracing this, breaking, making language bad, incorporating failure deliberately into the structure is done not as a matter of, oh, it's symptomatic of just the nature of language, but it's done deliberately. Failure is at the center of this process. Karen Solie, who will be here in the winter as part of the Gustafsson series, is definitely a proponent of this. Begins her most recent book, not chapbook, but her most recent book, by acknowledging that failure that error is central. Beginning the book as she does, she takes up a long history, probably of more epic poets, who begin by invoking the muse at the beginning of this incredible adventure, this incredible poem, this incredible narrative, invoking that maybe the muse will inspire the best work, starting from a place of weakness, a place of, and again, it might be a conceit, but starting from a place of acknowledging weakness as a human being, a human writer, and saying, gosh darn, I need your help. This whole idea of failure being generative. This is something that's being taken up by a number of contemporary poets who embrace it not only in their style, but in their content, which I think is really exciting. It's something that I'm really interested in. Interesting aside, I'm going to make another mistake. I love this fact that the idea of errata, the idea of plural errors, is so close to the muse of lyric poetry, who is erato. There is no relationship, even though it sounds, it's homophonically in line, but there's actually no sort of etymological connection between these. But I love that correspondence. It's that kind of work that we see done in poetry, that we see in literature, that stretching of connection that is so generative. But ultimately, it's a failed comparison. It doesn't exist, but we can make believe it does. So let me wrap up for you. Again, to come back to this idea of failure as a possible ethics, from a personal perspective approaching the world, as a teacher's perspective of trying to get students to learn better, to learn more, to retain more, to appreciate their time here at VIU, the special place that it is. From an ethical perspective, I want to end again with one more painting, one more picture from Caravaggio. Now, I love this, depicts David with the head of Goliath. Great biblical story. I love it for a number of reasons. One, it's an underdog story. I love the painting more so because David is not necessarily pleased holding the head of Goliath. It's like, well, it's okay. I did this amazing thing, but it's kind of peeved, kind of pensive. What's more important, too, is that you can't see it, but inscribed on the sword in the painting is this Latin, humilitas occidat superbiam. This idea that humility kills pride. And what we need today more than anything is this sense of humility. To be underdogs, to appreciate that, to be the hero, but ultimately to be humble in that way. So I want to leave off just with one more sort of broad, applicable passage from Sarah Bales, who wrote a book called The Poetics of Failure in Performance Theater. And this is another one that I hope that you can take away, this idea that failure isn't just limited to personal experience, to being in the classroom, or to studying poetry. That there's something broader about our world that we live in, which is very precarious in a number of ways, okay? That if failure opens us up to humility, and humility is ultimately this answer to uncertainty, and if we're headed down this dangerous road, a polarized road, and we need a little more failure, I think there's something interesting about what she says here. The discourse of failure as reflected in Western art and literature seems to counter the very idea of progress and victory that simultaneously dominate historical narratives. It undermines the perceived stability of mainstream capitalist ideology's preferred aspiration to achieve, succeed, or win, and the accumulation of material wealth as proof and effect arranged by those aims. Failure challenges the cultural dominance of instrumental rationality and the fictions of continuity that bind the way we imagine and manufacture the world. In its status as a wrongdoing, a failed objective establishes an aperture, an opening onto several and often many other ways of doing that counter the authority of a singular or correct outcome. So failure offers us a way of thinking through this crazy neoliberal situation we're in, hopefully it is one avenue, one tool, not the entirety, because again, I know it's not available to everyone. I'm speaking from a real place of privilege, and I have to be careful about laying this on you, demanding it of you. But I think it's one avenue that we haven't given enough credence to. And I think it's available to us. I think it's exciting. I think it's interesting. And I think it's fun. So I'm going to leave you with that. So I want to thank you all again for being here today. I appreciate it. Thank you for bearing with me, so to speak. And I'm going to turn over the floor for any questions you might have. How are we for time? Yeah, good. Oh, sure.
Normally the MC would come up here and finish off things, but he had to go, so I'm going to say a couple words here. Thanks very much to Mike Roberson for a stimulating and fascinating talk about failure, which I think is a topic we as academics often don't want to think about, right? Like failing is something I tend to try to avoid in my daily life, but thinking this time of year in particular with lots of marking backlog. But a really unique way of thinking about it poetically and philosophically and ethically as a productive force. In a second, we'll have Q&A. If anyone has any questions for Mike, I certainly have a couple. What I want to do, though, is also do a quick promo for the next colloquium presentation, which we come back in January with the second half of this year's series. So on January 19th, Dr. Bryn Skybo from English will present on a topic. The title is TBA, but it's about food, veganism, and Indigenous studies. So a really interesting kind of combination of topics for our next talk, January 19th, right here in the Malaspina Theatre, 10 till 11:30 on that day. So questions for Mike to finish off today. Anyone have any questions about failure?
Please don't fail to ask a question.
We've got Eliza over here.
Thanks, Mike. I'll start us off because I, like probably millions of people born and raised in North America, love a good rags to riches story. So this metaphor that you use visually and poetically of the underdog failing is a wonderful way to celebrate that part. But what do you think about this pattern that eventually the underdog succeeds? And that's really where the magic happens in regard to the American dream of, being rich and famous. Yes, you fail, but the best part of the story is when you turn that around. How do you consider that within your thesis?
This is the real world application of this question. I mean, we have this, but at the same time, what you're describing as the American dream or even the Canadian dream, the Western dream, is it's a mythology. It's a myth. It's certainly proven to be true many times, but it's becoming less and less attainable. It's becoming less and less attainable, not by people moving to America. I mean, this is from an immigrant. This is originally rooted in an immigrant experience. It's becoming less and less available to all. And so the question obviously is not that, how can an embrace of failure answer that issue, other than to say that there's a problem in the ideology behind that sort of meritocratic obsession. It's the same part of the narrative that tells us what success looks like at any one stage that is so invested in the material. And I think the idea is, if we just even scale back on the word failure, if we're more invested in, again, building blocks in the process of appreciation moments. I mentioned what I was talking about to my wife, and she kind of rolled her eyes, because one of the things that I wanted to say was that, there is no end of the rainbow. There are only rainbows. This is the terminology, which is kind of goofy. But that's the idea, is that if we let that myth of what we can ultimately achieve, that rags to riches is, right, it can drive hope. That's terrific. But if it doesn't happen, and for most of us it really doesn't happen in the way that we think it does, or the way that the mythology promises, it comes with disappointment. So if we scale back that and think about sort of more, right, the process of getting there as being as more valuable, we might be, right, we might be somehow better off. But right, that's just one perspective on that issue. But it is a real big, it's a mythology, right? And it's a mythology based in, right, capitalist ideology. And it's problematic, but it's necessary. We need money to live. We need resources. So, you know, it's a real catch-22 to be in that.
You consider death a failure?
What's that?
Do you consider death a failure?
Consider which?
Death.
Death? I don't consider death a failure. I consider the fact that death is the result of our body that fails, that our body is aging is one way of thinking about it, is it's constantly failing. Most things about being a human being are results of failing, whether it's, you know, from the upside of learning something or developing or mutating, right? In fact, death might be a triumph in some fashion. It is not a failure. We can't control it, right? It happens.
But what about like the case where somebody loses their mind and like amnesia, they don't know who they are or who their family is, like dementia? Would that be considered a death of them? Like they have died, but their body's still alive then?
That, I mean, one way of framing that would be to think about the failure of the human organism, of the brain, some capacity that we can't control. I mean, we can stave it off. There's ongoing research about how to do that or where it comes from, but it's still quite mysterious. But it's not. I mean, it is, and again, it is a failure to a degree of the human body, and of course, I think I'm less inclined to you know, put a value judgment on that kind. Just to understand that it is a very real aspect of whether we, unfortunately, some of us succumb to dementia or Alzheimer's. Eventually, the rest of us will pass away from some other aspect. It's not to be feared in that way. Another one of my developed sayings is to say, we have everything to fear. We have absolutely everything to fear, but fear itself. Everything is scary. That's not a question. But don't need to be afraid of it. Don't need to, it's like failure is scary, but don't need to be afraid of failing, right? It's horrible, but it's going to happen, right? Just like death is inevitable. It's not, right? Is it scary? Yeah. But we don't need to be afraid of being afraid of it. We can acknowledge it. It's the same of failure in that way.
There's a question down here on the other side.
I don't know if it's really a question, but I worked most of my career in the tech sector.
Yeah.
For a consulting company in Ottawa. And it's definitely in the culture of the technology companies. And if you look at Steve Jobs, I mean, Apple almost went bankrupt in 1999 or something like that. And he founded Next, and it did go bankrupt. And yet, you know, obviously he recovered. So I think also in your work as an academic and teacher, it is actually good if you can instill in students the idea that you shouldn't be too afraid to fail, because you'll learn something from that. And then maybe that will give you the basis for success the next time around. That taking some risks is actually a good thing in life. So I don't know, observations. Interesting talk, very entertaining.
So it's, and I'm glad you brought up technology, because few things that I just didn't have time to talk about. So this is as you know, all the code 404, which is a failure, right? It's essentially, but and of course, when we are so frustrated when our technology fails, there's a whole aspect of art and poetry in particular called glitch art, which takes the failure of our technology, which is a very real aspect of our lives. We think it's beyond us, it's technology. No, it's integrated because our technology is integrated. So it uses those breakdowns as a medium and brings them deliberately into art, makes messy, has scrambled, pixelated work, you know, in order to showcase that fact of if one of the art's responsibility is to, you know, shed light on the real world, whatever that means at this time, it definitely needs to include these sort of glitchy, messy components, right? So there's that one thing that to bring in technology. Second is that a lot of the studies being done about failure itself that are promising, that espouse the idea, that are valuable, have to do with video games. Basically, the art of failing at video games. There is a great game called Hades, where the object of the game is to die. In order to win the game, you must die, you must fail. In gaming, failure is embedded in that process. You don't proceed unless you fail. You don't learn, and it's deliberately integrated in a way that we kind of shy away from for most learning situations. But in video games, it's central to that. And of course, it becomes, advocated for and as a model for thinking about learning. Again, I want to thank you for bringing up this aspects of technology. If I were to say one more thing, again, I said I wasn't going to bring up Samuel Beckett's, fail better idea, but it becomes a kind of slogan for startups and for technology. It's like, oh, embrace it, fail harder, right? The idea is fail harder, learn more, because it's an ultimate path to success. I'm really less interested. I'm more interested in deconstructing, right, that rainbow, that illusion, and more focused on let's learn right now. Let's deal in the moment in that way.
Thanks for your great talk, Mike. I guess I'm just curious, when you present the idea of failure to your students, do you get pushback? How do they react? Because so much of academic and secondary training is about success, learning success, outcomes. Does that resonate with them, or do they resist it?
So in the same way that I was talking about growth mindset, or any of the workshops that are conducted by CL, you never hear the word failure. You don't, because it's frightening. There's going to be pushback. So I don't actually use the word failure either, but I'm going to start because I'm inspired. That's why, this is what's inspiring about doing this. I'm not just talking about what I've all done. This is inspiring me to move forward because I think I want to do that. I want to bring it in deliberately because I kind of sneak it in. My first assignment, I tell them, I need you to write me a paragraph. This is for first year university writing and research. I want you to write me a paragraph, what you think is an academic paragraph, answering the question, what can English 115 do for you? And I call it a show and tell exercise. You're showing me what kind of writer you are, and I haven't given you any instruction. I don't tell you what a paragraph looks like or what it's supposed to do. So you're telling me, or you're showing me what kind of writer you are, but then you're also telling me what kind of shape you want to have. The ultimate occurrence is that they don't know what they're doing, and it's a failed experiment. But for me, right, it gives me a lot of information, a lot of I call it the initial self-diagnostic, gives me a lot. But what do? It's the first assignment, I don't grade it. You do it, you turn it on time, you get full credit. So that's the way that we reward that risk-taking behavior. But I don't say, I'm gonna set you up for failure here, right? Because that's freaky. But if we start to do it, if we say, if I were to do, I might experiment the next time I teach that, is to say, I'm going to use this language very deliberately, and I'm going to integrate this idea that John Berger does, which is to say, come in and spout off your fails, brag about how well you failed. It's a little bit of it's a risk, but I'm curious to see how that will work. The other way that I integrate this is to say, okay, in these early assignments, they don't know what they're doing, and they're cumulative. They build. One of the ways that I reward those early failures is to allow them to revise ultimately in their final, which then I allow them, right? But they're forced to do this reflexive exercise. You failed originally, but you've learned something. Turn it into a teaching moment where you show me what you learned in that way, and you get an improved grade. So I'm rewarding those early struggles where you're like, oh man, I didn't do so well on this. Well, you get an opportunity, right? But not just to revise. You have to reflect on it. You have to show me what you learned in that way. But yes, I'm going to experiment with saying, I even want to teach a class about which again, to pick up where John LePage left off, bring in that book, Being Wrong, and see what students do with it.
And one last question there.
Thanks, Mike. Really enjoyed that. And I will continue to enjoy it because there's lots to think about. Man, I'm going to be a little bit unfair and bundle two things because I know we're short of time. And the first is potential learnings from, so thinking about technology and potential learnings from the design disciplines and prototyping as pedagogy, where the word failure isn't really part of the enterprise, but testing ideas, prototyping multiple copies and seeing what sticks and what resonates. And then the second part is the potential opportunities for us in AI as in the academy because of the requirement for us to completely rethink assessment and what that, and potentially your thoughts on putting those two things together. And in some ways, you alluded to it in your first assignment example there, but just your thoughts on the potential of those things.
Yeah, I mean, I'm one. Actually, I was just told that by someone that Queens, across the board, their policy is no AI, no use of AI at all, right? Generative AI in that way. And I thought, wow, that's really kind of naive, because that's going to prompt some people to do it anyway, to figure out how to do it, which, again, to innovate, to be nonconformist, I love that attitude, but it's naive from a university perspective to have that kind of policy. So I embrace the idea of bringing it in because we have to figure it out in tandem. We have to figure out how are students going to use it? How are they going to use it wrong? Because most of them are using it wrong right now. What can we learn from that failure to use it correctly in order to use it correctly? I think that's the real opportunity here, is to be very, very transparent about this. Now, I mean, everybody has their own policies. It's completely up to you, but that's my sense of how to integrate that, is to figure out, and again, through modalities of thinking about what's working, what's not, what's effective, what in relying on this are you not doing for yourself that you're not learning something, that it's, in other words, how do we use it as a tool for learning and not as a crutch, so to speak? And I think that's the real opportunity we have now, by learning from the failure of what it does and what it doesn't do. Because on the one hand, we're using it as a tool, but we're also helping the AI to get better in that way as well. I mean, that would be my kind of response to that. I mean, I'm excited for it. I haven't had to deal with it other than people who are trying to use it without giving credit. And I say, just give credit like everything else. So.
Okay, thanks very much, Mike. Thanks for all those questions. Thanks for coming today too. I appreciate it as the chair of the colloquium committee. Free tea and coffee in the lobby if you're so inclined. But thanks again to Mike Roberson for a fascinating talk.
One last thing, I didn't talk about this. This is a Man Ray piece, right? This poem, it's called Untitled. Notice, it's so beautiful, right? If you want to read along with me. No, the idea is that, right? This is a testament to absolute failure. It can't even say what it's supposed to say. It's just blank, or some sort of Morse code in that way. Anyway, thank you all for being here. I'll see you upstairs.